Hey everybody, it's Mitch, and today we're going to be talking about Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. We're going to be talking about Pathfinder 1st edition, and we're going to be talking about GURPS 4th edition. We're going to be comparing, we're going to be contrasting, we're going to be talking about which system is the best, in my opinion, for what purposes, and all that good fun stuff. Now, for a little background, I, Mitch, play mostly D&D 3.5. That's my specialty. But we're going to be talking about the other systems. We're not going to talk about 3.5 today. I have plenty of other videos where I do that. So first off, let's talk about D&D 5e, the actual successor to D&D 3.5, although it's 2 down the road. So D&D 5e came out after D&D 4e came out, and people hated it for the most part. There's people that liked it, but a lot of people really didn't like it. And that brought birth to Pathfinder, which we'll talk about here in a second. And that really hurt Dungeons and Dragons as a brand. So, somewhat recently, I say somewhat recently, it was like 10 years ago at this point, but Wizards of the Coast, the creators of Dungeons and Dragons, decided they're going to listen to the fans and bring back a Dungeons and Dragons experience that was much more similar to 3.5. But they cut out a lot of the complexity and they made it much more user friendly. So that's really what 5e is. It's a very accessible Dungeons and Dragons. It takes kind of the core of 3.5, but makes it really accessible. Now, in doing so, they did cut down on a lot of the options. There's just not a lot of character options that you can have. You're kind of forced to some extent into having one of several dozen character options. You have your several different races, a dozen or two different classes, and then each class has, in core they have three, but later I've heard that they've expanded out to like 12 different subclasses. So you have different options on what you can do, but that's kind of it. You're really locked into just that. Yeah, you can multi-class and that gives you some characterization, but you lose a lot, and there's just not as many reasons to multi-class as there are in other systems. It's very limiting, but it's very, very accessible. It's so much easier to just grab a character sheet, make a character, and just play. So much more so than it is in other editions. It still can be very intimidating to new players, especially if you're going for high levels, but it's much easier to do, even especially with high levels, than it is in other editions. Now, let's talk about Pathfinder. We were talking about that a second ago. Pathfinder, it was the spiritual successor to 3.5. It's what 3.5 players kind of moved towards after they found they didn't like 4e. So they played Pathfinder First Edition. It kept a lot of what they loved about 3.5. It fixed some of the things that they considered to be bugs with the game, made by a completely different company, although I've heard that there were a lot of developers that were from 3.5 that did actually switch over to Pathfinder to make it. So it's got a lot of the same creators, but copyright is held by a completely different company, all that fun stuff. So, there's some weird stuff with that going on. But it's not a bad system by any stretch of the imagination. I rather enjoyed it the little bit I played it. So it's not bad. They definitely changed some stuff up. 5e even took some inspiration from Pathfinder. So that's kind of cool. I don't know. I think it's a pretty solid system overall. Now, it isn't as lore heavy as Dungeons and Dragons, largely for copyright reasons. Like, Dungeons and Dragons has been building on its lore since the 70s, I think. And that's just kind of been how they've been working. Whereas Pathfinder wasn't able to use any of that lore because, copyright. And so it's a little bit lacking because it's just kind of the new kid on the block. So there's that. But the two are fairly similar in a lot of ways. And they're both D20 systems. They're both based off of 3.5 to some extent, one more so than the other, that being Pathfinder. Pathfinder is definitely a little harder to get into. There's definitely a lot more customization. It's also regularly updated online, or at least it was before 2.0 came out. I'm not sure if it still is or not. You guys feel free to let me know if you know. But yeah, that's Pathfinder First Edition. And D&D 5e, they're both D20 systems. So you roll a D20 like I have right here. And they use all the same dice. The D20 is just your main one. Those are the systems. It uses a square grid. Very, very similar in a lot of regards. but at least the base mechanics. But they changed a lot. There's a way more options and customization in Pathfinder. It's way more rules and mechanics heavy than Pathfinder is way more rules and mechanics heavy than 5e. That's just what it is. Now, GURPS is a completely different animal. GURPS does not use a d20 system. GURPS uses a 3d6 system. So it'll use 3d6 or six-sided die. As you can see, use your standard six-sided die. Whereas before, what I was saying with d20, it's got your 20-sided die. Very different dice. Now, GURPS also has a hex grid. So when you're doing combat, it's on a hex system. And everything's built around that. GURPS, it's also a very generic system. So it has no lore by design. It's one where you're very much encouraged to put your own lore into the game. You take lore that you came up with, or maybe you inspired by some other world, and you're just taking that lore and putting it into your game. That's very much what GURPS is designed to do. 3d6 system, it creates kind of a bell curve. So your odds of success are going to be tend towards the middle. Outliers where you roll particularly high or low aren't going to occur particularly often in GURPS. You're going to most of the time roll average, whereas in 3.5 you're going to be rolling all over the place. You're just as likely to roll good as you are bad. Same with GURPS, but you're just as likely to roll good as you are bad as you are average. Whereas GURPS, much more likely to roll average than good or bad. And I think it's more realistic in a lot of ways as well, because realistically, things follow bell curves. The hex grid's also interesting. There's also facing in the game, so you're facing a certain direction, whereas 3.5 and 5e do not have facing. You're just considered to be facing all directions at once all the time. Whereas GURPS, it's like, no, you're facing left or you're facing right. But there's 6 different directions you could potentially be facing, and then there's always you always have a blind spot behind you. It's very in-depth, it's very detailed, and I do like that. GURPS is just a really solid system overall. It's one of my favorites. Of these 3, it's probably my favorite, to be honest. Although, to be fair to Pathfinder, I haven't played it nearly as much. That's the different systems. Now, if you're a new player that just wants to have something fun that you can jump into real quick, 5e is the way to go. That's by far the best system for that out there. It's very easy to play. It's user-friendly. It's not hard to get into. Whereas GURPS is the one you want to go with if you want to be playing some detailed like superhero fantasy or something that's very much not high fantasy. So if you want to do, superheroes or Star Wars theme or whatever, or maybe you want to play some anime theme, GURPS is definitely going to be the better of the systems for that, because it's better at incorporating non-high fantasy elements. And on top of that, it's a good system. Now, if you're looking for a high fantasy game with lots of rules and mechanics, Pathfinder's probably your best bet for that. It's got a decent amount of lore already built in, not nearly as much as D&D 5e, because that's got all the D&D lore, which is consistent throughout editions. In fact, it's actually more in the later editions than in the earlier editions, because you can just kind of import lore from the older editions for the most part. It's all the same games. Wizards of the Coast owns it all, so But Pathfinder, they had to create their own lore. GURPS decided not to make lore. It's just generic. It's a generic game. In fact, that's actually what the G in GURPS stands for. GURPS stands for Generic Universal Role-Playing System. GURPS is very much designed for you to just kind of take any old game that you want to make and throw together and just work for it. And I think that's really cool about GURPS, is that you can just play it for any scenario that you're potentially looking to do. So yeah, those are the different systems. I recommend them differently for different players. Personally, I prefer GURPS of the 3, then probably Pathfinder, and then last I'd probably say 5e. 5e just doesn't have the options that the other systems have. You're kind of locked into just a few stuff, which is part of what makes it accessible. Is there's not a lot to choose from. You don't have to figure out, okay, how do I optimize this character? It's like, nah, which character do you want? Whereas there's character optimization is a big part of Pathfinder and a big part of GURPS. So those are things I love about it. Now, my favorite system is 3.5, but we're not talking about that here. If you want to hear about that, I have got literally hundreds of other videos on this channel for that. But that's really all I have to say for the 3 systems that I'm talking about: Pathfinder 1st edition, D&D 5e, and GURPS 4th edition. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments below. I'm always interested in hearing from you. Subscribe for more Dungeons & Dragons content, mostly 3.5. I also have links down below to my Discord as well as to my Twitch, because I stream on Twitch. Probably this video was actually recorded like a year and a half before it's actually being released. Anyways, as always, I'm Mitch. Seeing ya.